At dinner, my wife looked me straight in the eye and said, "I'm leaving you." I kept my cool, but when the door opened behind her, her face just crumbled. "Hi, I'm Grant, and I thought I knew everything about loyalty until betrayal knocked me flat." What would you do if the person you trusted most blindsided you like that? Stay tuned, because this story isn't just about heartbreak, it's about finding strength when your world falls apart. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced a moment that changed everything in an instant? Grant's morning coffee tasted different that day, bitter, though he couldn't say why. The house was quiet, filled with the familiar creaks of old floorboards settling as the autumn wind whispered through the half-cracked window. Grant adjusted his robe and glanced at the clock. 6:42 a.m. Usually, Elena was still asleep at this hour, tucked under her floral quilt. But today, her spot was empty, her side of the bed cold when he reached over earlier. Now he stood in the doorway of their small kitchen, taking in the sight of her sitting at the table, already dressed, staring into a cup of tea. The sunlight filtering through the blinds caught the silver in her hair. She looked up briefly, offering a faint smile. "You're up early," he said, keeping his tone light. Elena nodded, her eyes darting back to her tea. "Just couldn't sleep." Grant hesitated, sensing there was more, but after nearly 40 years together, he'd learned to let her set the pace. He settled into his chair, buttered a slice of toast, and glanced over at her again. A quiet sigh escaped her lips, barely noticeable, but it tugged at something inside him, an itch he couldn't quite reach. The morning passed with its usual rhythm. Grant finished the crossword puzzle, folded the newspaper, and decided to take a walk down to Main Street. The crisp October air bit at his cheeks as he strolled, the golden leaves crunching beneath his sneakers. Familiar sounds of lawnmowers hummed from nearby yards, and a few kids zipped past on their bikes, jackets flapping. He pushed open the door to the Main Street Cafe, the small brass bell jingling above him. The place smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon, a comforting contrast to the chill outside. "Morning, Grant," Carl called from behind the counter, drying his hands on a checkered towel. "Morning, Carl," Grant replied, sliding onto his usual stool by the window. "Black coffee, like always." "You got it." They exchanged the easy banter of two men well acquainted with each other's routines. Carl set the steaming cup in front of him and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Hey, meant to ask, you and Elena doing all right?" Grant blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah, why?" Carl shrugged, eyes flicking toward the window. I saw her out late the other night. Twice, actually. Thought maybe she had a class or something?" Grant frowned. "Out late?" "Yeah, like after 9. Didn't look like her usual book club crowd either." "Maybe I'm just being nosy," Carl added quickly, holding up his hands. Grant forced a smile. "No worries. Probably nothing." But a seed had been planted, small and nagging. The walk home felt different. His usual nods to neighbors felt distracted, his thoughts circling back to Carl's words. When he reached their street, Debbie from next door waved him over. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" she said cheerfully, setting down a basket of mums on her porch. "Sure is," Grant replied. Debbie tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "Everything okay, Grant? Haven't seen you and Elena out walking together lately." He brushed it off with a chuckle. "Busy, I guess." But her warm, observant gaze lingered a second longer than usual, as if she saw something he didn't want to admit. That evening, as the sky faded to a soft lavender, Grant set the table for dinner. Elena moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, placing plates of baked chicken and mashed potatoes down without meeting his eyes. The meal was quiet, too quiet. Forks clinked against plates, the old wall clock ticking louder than usual. Grant cleared his throat. "Carl mentioned he saw you out the other night." Elena's hand froze mid-air, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Oh?" "Said it was pretty late." She set her fork down carefully. "I couldn't sleep. Took a walk." Grant studied her face, looking for cracks, but she kept her gaze steady, her tone polite but cool. The conversation drifted to mundane things after that, the weather, the neighbor's new puppy, but the tension clung to the air like a heavy fog. After dinner, Elena cleared the dishes while Grant settled into his armchair with a book. His eyes wandered to the mantel, to the old wedding photo of them on a sunlit beach, her veil catching the breeze. The frame was dusty, the glass slightly smudged, as if forgotten. A sharp buzz broke the silence. Grant glanced up to see Elena's phone lighting up on the kitchen counter, vibrating insistently. She dried her hands quickly and grabbed it, her eyes darting to him before she silenced it with a few swift taps. "Wrong number," she said lightly, almost too quickly, and turned her back to him, humming as she resumed washing. Grant's brow furrowed. Something was off. He wanted to ask more, press further, but the weight of decades together made him hesitate. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was imagining things. Later that night, the house settled into darkness. Grant lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the soft glow of the street lamp casting long shadows across the room. He shifted, turning toward the doorway, just in time to see Elena slip quietly into the hall with her phone pressed to her chest. He waited, heart thudding, and after a few minutes, crept down the hall. Peeking around the corner, he saw her standing by the window, bathed in pale moonlight, fingers flying over her screen. And there it was, the small, anxious smile spreading across her face, the kind of smile he hadn't seen from her in years. Grant stepped back into the shadows, a cold knot twisting in his gut. The leaves were falling fast now, and so, it seemed, was Grant's peace of mind. The crisp scent of pine and drying leaves drifted in through the open kitchen window as Grant sat at the table, staring at his untouched coffee. He tapped his fingers against the ceramic mug, his thoughts circling the same words over and over, Carl's casual mention of Elena's late nights. No matter how he tried to brush it off, the comment kept resurfacing, louder each time, like the relentless ticking of their living room clock. Elena breezed into the room, dressed smartly in a navy blouse and slacks, her hair neatly pinned. "I won't be late," she said, grabbing her purse from the chair. "Another meeting?" Grant asked, trying to sound offhand but failing to keep the tension from his voice. She didn't meet his eyes as she slipped on her coat. "Yes. The fundraising committee's behind schedule. You know how it is." He nodded slowly, watching her every move. She kissed his cheek, cool and quick, before heading out the door, the click of her heels fading down the walkway. The silence that followed pressed in around him. He sat there for a few moments, staring at the front door, before standing abruptly. He grabbed his keys and jacket, stepping out into the cool dusk. The small town of Somerville was beginning to glow under the amber hue of streetlights, and the sound of laughter and clinking dishes drifted from Pinecrest Diner as he approached. Inside, the place was bustling. Waitresses wove between booths with practiced ease, refilling coffee mugs and balancing plates piled high with burgers and fries. Grant slid into a corner booth, nodding a greeting to the familiar faces around him. "Evening, Grant," called Sherry, the waitress, as she wiped down the counter. "The usual?" "Yeah, thanks," he replied, forcing a smile. As he settled back, the bell above the door chimed, and in walked Margot, widow, late 50s, sharp-eyed and always dressed a little too carefully. She spotted him and smiled, walking over. "Well, look who's out late," she teased, sliding into the seat across from him before he could protest. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Just needed to get out of the house." Sherry brought over his meatloaf special, setting it down with a wink. "Margot, can I get you anything?" "Tea, please. And maybe just some toast." Margot turned back to Grant, her eyes crinkling kindly. "Elena busy?" Grant hesitated, then sighed. "Yeah. Another meeting." Margot studied him for a beat, her fingers playing with her teacup. "You look uneasy." He stared at his plate, pushing peas around with his fork. "Carl mentioned something the other day. Said he saw Elena out late a few times. Not her usual routine." Margot's expression softened, her gaze flicking toward the window. "Small towns don't keep secrets for long. You know that." Grant offered a tight smile. "Sometimes I wish they did." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Margot spoke again, her tone thoughtful. I remember when things started to unravel with my ex. It wasn't one big thing. It was little things. A tone, a look, a missed dinner. You start feeling it before you see it. Grant looked at her, grateful for her quiet honesty. Did you ever ask him outright? She laughed softly, a sound tinged with sadness. Of course. But people lie, Grant. Especially when they're afraid of the truth. Her words lingered between them as Grant finished his meal, the noise of the diner washing around them like a steady tide. He thanked her for the company as they parted outside, both heading their separate ways under the dim glow of the street lamps. Back home, the house felt colder than before. Elena hadn't returned yet, and Grant found himself pacing. When she finally walked in an hour later, her smile was tight, her eyes tired. "How was your meeting?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "Fine," she replied, slipping off her coat. It ran long. He leaned against the doorway, studying her. "Everything okay? You've seemed distant lately." Elena stiffened, her back to him. "I'm just tired, Grant. And honestly, you're starting to sound paranoid." He held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. I'm sorry. I just worry." She sighed, turning to face him with a weary smile. "I know. But it's nothing, really." They said little else as they prepared for bed, each lost in their own thoughts. Later, after Elena had fallen asleep, Grant gathered their coats from the rack by the door. Something made him pause, an instinct he couldn't ignore. He reached into the pocket of Elena's coat and pulled out a crumpled receipt. His eyes scanned it quickly. La Bella Vita, a cozy Italian restaurant downtown. Dinner for two. Friday night. His breath caught. That wasn't the committee meeting she'd claimed. Heart pounding, he slipped the receipt into his desk drawer, closing it slowly. He sat there for a long time in the dim light, staring at the drawer, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence around him. A single receipt had the power to keep Grant up all night, and it did. He lay on his side, eyes wide open in the darkened bedroom, watching the faint shadows shift across the ceiling as moonlight seeped in through the blinds. Every so often, he turned to glance at Elena, sleeping soundly beside him, her breathing soft and even. The drawer in his office might as well have been glowing with the weight of that crumpled receipt. His mind circled back again and again, La Bella Vita, 2 Atres, a date that didn't match any of the meetings she'd mentioned. Morning came too soon, but the heaviness in Grant's chest didn't lift with the daylight. He moved through the motions, coffee, toast, reading the paper, but the words blurred, and his focus kept drifting. Elena, humming softly to herself, seemed none the wiser, chatting lightly about the upcoming church gathering. Grant nodded along, but every word she spoke felt laced with double meaning now. By late morning, they were pulling into the gravel lot of the First Community Church, where families and retirees gathered weekly for worship and a potluck brunch. The familiar buzz of conversation and laughter filled the hall as people settled into their usual spots. Grant shook hands, offered polite smiles, but felt detached, as though watching it all from behind glass. He caught sight of Debbie across the room, a neighbor and longtime friend, her arms full of baked goods as she navigated toward the serving table. She gave him a warm smile and a little wave, eyes narrowing slightly as she took in his stiff expression. "Grant," she said as she approached, setting down her dish, "you look like you've seen a ghost. Everything okay?" Grant forced a chuckle. "Just didn't sleep much last night. You know how it is." Debbie's gaze lingered, curious but kind. "Anything you want to talk about?" He hesitated, glancing toward Elena, who was deep in conversation with a group of ladies by the window. I guess I've just been a little concerned about Elena lately." "Nothing specific." Debbie's brow creased, her voice dropping slightly. "Well, you know how it is in a town like this. People talk. If there's anything going on, it usually finds its way out sooner or later." He nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah. I suppose it does." The conversation drifted to safer topics, local news, upcoming charity drives, but Debbie's probing glance stayed with him. He found himself distracted through most of the service, fidgeting as Pastor Mike took to the pulpit. The sermon that day, of all things, was about honesty, about how truth was the foundation of any strong home. Grant's jaw tightened as he listened, each word hitting a little too close to home. Pastor Mike, oblivious, smiled warmly, speaking of forgiveness and trust, but to Grant, it sounded like a quiet rebuke. Later that afternoon, back home, Elena retreated to the kitchen to prepare dinner, humming a tune Grant didn't recognize. He watched her from the doorway for a moment, then slipped away to his office. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time in years, he felt like a stranger in his own home. His office smelled faintly of old books and lemon oil, papers stacked high on the desk, framed photos lining the walls, a lifetime of memories, most of them now casting long shadows. He sat down and opened the drawer, staring at the receipt as if it might speak. His fingers itched with a need to know more. Pulling open another drawer, he rifled through old bills and statements, his pulse quickening. It was slow at first, nothing out of the ordinary. Utility bills, bank statements, birthday cards tucked between old tax documents. But then his hand stilled. A slim envelope, addressed to Elena, with a bank's logo he didn't recognize. His heart pounded as he unfolded the paper inside. A credit card statement, charges from places he'd never been, some familiar, others not, and dates that prickled his skin. Restaurants, hotel bookings, purchases at boutiques he knew Elena never mentioned. He sank back in his chair, staring at the pages. A second card? Why had she never told him? The clock on the wall ticked louder now, matching the beat of his heart. His fingers tightened around the paper as realization settled heavily on his chest. Dinner was quiet that evening. Too quiet. The clinking of cutlery against plates filled the space where conversation should have been. Elena smiled faintly, asking how his day had gone, her eyes calm and distant. Grant answered in clipped phrases, his mind whirring. Afterward, he followed her into the living room as she settled down with a book. He stood there for a long moment, watching her, words gathering like a storm behind his lips. "Anything you want to tell me?" His voice was low, almost casual. Elena looked up slowly, her eyes wide, caught between surprise and something unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her gaze flickering down to her book as if nothing had happened at all. And she said nothing. Some truths are whispered, others shout so loudly, you can't ignore them. Grant parked the car at the curb, staring at the familiar silhouette of his house. The porch light glowed softly, and in the distance, a few neighbors had already strung up early holiday lights, their twinkle muted under the deepening dusk. He hadn't planned to come home early from his errands, but something, a quiet tug in his chest, had urged him back. He stepped out, clutching the bag of groceries, and made his way to the door. As he slid his key into the lock, he paused. Through the wooden frame, faint but distinct, he caught the soft lilt of Elena's voice. He froze, straining to hear. It wasn't her usual clipped, distracted tone. No, this was different, gentler, warm in a way he hadn't heard in years. "I miss you too," she whispered, her voice low and intimate. Grant's stomach twisted. He stood there for a beat longer, heart hammering, before pushing open the door. The sound of her voice cut off instantly, replaced by the shuffling of papers, the scrape of a chair. He stepped inside, forcing his breathing to even out. "Elena," he called lightly, setting the grocery bag on the counter. "In here," she answered, emerging from the dining room with a polite smile, eyes carefully neutral. She smoothed her blouse, tucking a stray hair behind her ear. "Didn't expect you back so soon." "Traffic was light," he replied, eyes scanning her face, searching for cracks. She was good, too good. If he hadn't hurt her himself, he might have believed the innocent act. They moved through the motions of the evening, dinner prepared and eaten with mechanical conversation, dishes washed in silence. Grant's mind raced, every glance, every gesture of Elena's dissected and re-examined. He wanted to ask, to blurt out what he'd overheard, but something held him back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was fear of hearing her confirm his darkest suspicions. Later, as they sat side by side on the couch, the soft glow of the TV flickering across their faces, he finally turned to her. "Elena," he began, voice measured, "are you happy?" She blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "In general. With us." She looked down at her hands, fingers tracing the edge of a cushion. "Of course," she said too quickly. "Why do you ask?" He studied her, the way her eyes avoided his, the way her shoulders seemed to tense under the weight of the question. I don't know. Things feel different lately." She shrugged, forcing a small laugh. "We've been married a long time, Grant. It's normal for things to settle." Settle. The word landed like a stone in his chest. "Right," he said quietly, nodding. He didn't push further. "Not yet." Elena excused herself early, claiming a headache, and retreated upstairs. Grant sat alone, the house settling into its nighttime hush around him. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, each second stretching like an eternity. He stared at the darkened TV screen, the reflection of the empty room looking back at him. Finally, he stood. Upstairs, the bedroom was dark, except for the faint glow of Elena's phone on the nightstand, pulsing softly with each notification. She was asleep, her breathing slow and even, one arm draped over the pillow. Grant's heart pounded as he moved closer, each step heavy with guilt and determination. He picked up the phone, the cool glass slick against his palm. His thumb hovered for a moment before he unlocked it. Elena wasn't one to hide her passcodes. Not until now, at least. The messages loaded slowly, and then, all at once, the truth spilled out in sharp, undeniable words. Victor. Dozens of texts, some playful, others achingly intimate. Phrases that made his breath hitch, that dug into old wounds he didn't even know he had. Can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again? Miss you already. Elena's replies were no better. Smiling emojis, affectionate words, so different from the cold distance she'd shown him for months. Grant sank into the chair by the window, gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. Outside, a cool autumn wind rattled the windowpane, leaves skittering across the driveway like whispers of everything he'd just read. Across the street, he noticed a young couple laughing as they strung more lights along their porch, their joy effortless and untainted. It felt like a cruel parallel, a mirror of everything he'd lost without realizing it. He sat there for what felt like hours, the phone screen dimming and brightening as new messages popped up. But he didn't need to read more. He had seen enough. The house was still dark when morning came, a muted gray light creeping through the blinds. Elena appeared cheerful, humming softly as she made coffee, acting as if nothing in the world had shifted. Grant watched her, his face unreadable, his heart a fortress of turmoil and betrayal. He sipped his coffee slowly, eyes never leaving her. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "We need to talk. Tonight." Elena's voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed her. "It's not what you think, Grant." For a long second, the kitchen seemed to still. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound between them, their reflections dimly visible in the dark window above the sink. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing dried leaves against the back porch steps, but neither of them moved. Grant had stayed up all night rehearsing what he'd say, thinking he'd feel prepared when the moment came. He wasn't. The weight of the phone in his hand, the texts he'd read, those intimate messages, the whispered "I miss you" from the night before, they had all left him hollowed out. He placed the phone on the kitchen table between them, the screen still dark but its meaning unavoidable. "I saw everything," he said, voice low, almost ragged. "Victor. The messages. The dinner dates. You can't tell me I'm imagining things now." Elena's shoulders tensed, her arms crossed tight over her chest. "It's not what you think," she repeated, but her gaze darted away, down to her feet, her breath quickening. "It's complicated." Grant's laugh was brittle. "Complicated? You're telling another man you miss him, Elena. That's not complicated. That's clear." She turned then, hands gripping the edge of the counter. For a moment, she said nothing, and Grant thought she might actually confess, explain, offer something real. But when she spoke, her words came out sharp, defensive. "Do you have any idea how lonely I've been?" "For years, Grant. Years. You sit in your chair, you read your books, you go to the same cafe every morning, and you barely look at me." Grant flinched, as though struck. "And that's your excuse? That I've been, what, boring? Predictable? That justifies this?" Her eyes flashed. "No, but it explains it. I felt invisible. I needed something, someone, to remind me I was still alive." He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. The room felt stifling now, the warm glow of the overhead light casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. His coffee sat untouched, gone cold hours ago. "You could have said something," he murmured. "You could have told me." "I tried," Elena whispered. "You didn't want to hear it." The words hung there, bitter and heavy. Grant leaned against the table, staring at her, searching for the woman he thought he knew. She looked different now, tired, guarded, like a stranger wearing Elena's skin. The minutes stretched, the silence broken only by the soft patter of rain starting against the windows. Finally, Elena grabbed her purse from the chair, her jaw set. "I can't do this right now," she said, voice tight. "I need space." "Space," Grant echoed, his voice hollow. "Right." Without another word, she moved toward the door. He didn't stop her. He couldn't. He stood there, watching her pull on her coat, watching her shoulders tighten as she stepped out into the night. The door closed softly behind her, but the sound hit Grant like a slam. He stood frozen for a long time, staring at the empty room, the coffee cup, the flicker of porch light through the rain-streaked window. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the old wedding photo on the sideboard. Their faces smiled up at him, young, bright, full of hope. With a sudden, raw motion, Grant hurled the frame across the room. It hit the far wall with a sharp crack, glass shattering, the photo fluttering down like a wounded bird. He slumped into a chair, head in his hands, the weight of everything pressing down. Outside, the rain fell harder, a steady rhythm against the roof, as if the world itself were washing its hands of what had just happened. Hours passed. The lights in neighboring houses blinked off one by one, the street settling into its usual quiet. Grant sat in the dark, staring at the shards of glass on the floor, his thoughts circling the same questions, the same ache. Morning light crept slowly into the room, pale and gray. Grant sat at the kitchen table, bleary-eyed, when a soft knock sounded at the back door. He blinked, startled from his daze, and moved to open it. Debbie stood there, her cardigan pulled tight against the morning chill, her face lined with concern. "I saw her leave last night," she said quietly, eyes flicking past him into the house. "You okay?" Grant's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he stepped back, letting her see the broken frame on the floor, the coffee still sitting cold on the table. His expression said it all. "Do you want the truth, Grant? Fine. But you won't like what you hear." The words landed between them like a cold slap. Grant sat at the edge of the couch, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on Elena. Her posture was stiff, arms folded tightly across her chest, but her face was tired, and there was something hollow in her eyes that made him hesitate. Outside, the late afternoon sun filtered through yellowing leaves, casting long shadows across the living room floor. The world looked unchanged, but inside these walls, everything had shifted. "For years," Elena began, her voice low but steady, "I felt like a ghost in this house." Grant's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? We've had a good life." We had a routine," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "Breakfast at 7. Bills paid on time. Church on Sundays. And somewhere in all that, I disappeared." Grant opened his mouth to argue but shut it again. Instead, he stared at the coffee table, where an old coaster sat under his untouched mug, the coffee long since gone cold. Elena continued, her words tumbling out now, like she'd been holding them in for far too long. It's not just about Victor. This affair, it's not the disease, Grant. It's a symptom. Of everything we stopped seeing. Of me feeling invisible. The room felt heavier with each word. Grant rubbed his jaw, searching for something, anything, to say that might make sense of it all. Later that day, needing air and space to think, Grant wandered to the park. Pine leaves crunched under his shoes as he made his way to the old bench near the fountain. It was there, by some twist of timing, that he saw Margot again. She was sitting with a book, legs crossed, reading glasses perched on her nose. When she noticed him, she smiled softly, setting her book aside. "You look like you've been through a storm." Grant let out a bitter laugh and sank onto the bench beside her. For a moment, they sat in silence, watching a group of kids chasing each other near the swings, their laughter floating through the air, oblivious to adult heartbreak. "Rough day?" Margot asked gently. Grant nodded, eyes still on the playground. "She told me everything. Or, enough, at least. Years of loneliness. Feeling unseen. I don't know. It's like she's rewritten our whole marriage in a way I barely recognize." Margot was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "It's hard, Grant. Betrayal, it shakes your sense of reality." "I know. But sometimes it's not just the betrayal of a moment. It's years of little things piling up, things neither side sees until it's too late." Her words sat heavy between them. Grant thought back to the early years, picnics by the lake, love letters tucked in drawers, late-night talks about everything and nothing. When had they lost that? And why hadn't he noticed? "I found our old letters last week," he murmured. "Back when we were young and stupidly in love. I thought we'd made it through the hard parts." Margot sighed, her gaze distant. "We all think that. Until the cracks show up." For a while, they simply sat, watching as the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the park. A gentle breeze stirred fallen leaves, and the world felt both painfully beautiful and unbearably sad. Back home that evening, Grant sat alone in his office, leafing through those old letters. Each word, each promise, seemed to belong to another life. He ran his finger over Elena's familiar handwriting, wondering how they'd come to this. Hours later, Elena stepped into the room, her arms crossed but her eyes softer than before. "We need to finish this conversation," she said quietly. Grant looked up, weary. "I don't even know where to start." She moved to sit across from him. "Victor, he's not just anyone. He's been in our circle longer than you realize." Grant froze, the weight of her words settling over him like a stone. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Who exactly is he?" And in that moment, the fragile thread holding his world together felt ready to snap. "It's Victor Hammond," Elena whispered, and everything in Grant's mind rewired at once. For a moment, he just stared at her, words caught somewhere between his throat and his pounding heart. Victor Hammond. The name echoed in his skull, colliding with old memories, barbecues in the Hammond backyard, neighborhood block parties, hardware store runs where Victor always seemed eager to help with a smile and a clap on the back. The man who'd loaned them a power washer last spring. The man who stood next to him at church potlucks, talking about home repairs and the latest football scores. That Victor. Grant's pulse throbbed in his temples. "You mean, that Victor?" Elena only nodded, her eyes glassy but unflinching. "I never meant for it to happen." Grant stood slowly, as if his body were heavier than before. The room felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in. "I need air." He grabbed his jacket and stepped out into the cool evening, walking with no real destination until, almost unconsciously, he found himself standing outside Hammond's hardware store. The familiar red and white sign glowed softly under the streetlights, and through the wide front windows, Grant spotted Victor behind the counter, chatting easily with a customer. For several long minutes, Grant just watched from across the street. Every word Elena had said replayed in his mind, overlapping with Victor's smug laugh and easy confidence, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in ways that made his stomach churn. Without really deciding to, Grant crossed the street and stepped inside. Victor looked up, his expression shifting smoothly from polite customer service to something sharper, something knowing. Grant Mercer. To what do I owe the pleasure? Grant's voice was calm, almost too calm. We need to talk. Victor smiled tightly. About what? You know damn well what. The last customer glanced awkwardly between them, sensing something charged, and after paying, hurried out, leaving the store empty except for the two men. Victor leaned against the counter, arms crossed casually. Look, if this is about Elena, let's not make a scene. She's a grown woman. She made her choices. Grant's fists clenched at his sides, but his tone stayed even. You mean you made choices? Choices that destroyed a family. Victor chuckled, a cold, dismissive sound. Destroyed? Come on, Grant. Don't be so dramatic. You two were falling apart long before I came along. I was just convenient. For a heartbeat, Grant considered lunging across the counter, but something held him back. Instead, he stared Victor down, letting silence stretch between them until it was taut as wire. Finally, Grant said, his voice like ice, You think this is over? Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smirk didn't falter. It's done, Grant. You can't undo what's happened. Grant didn't answer. He simply turned and walked out, letting the door slam shut behind him. The air outside was crisp, biting, but it did nothing to cool the fury simmering just beneath his skin. His boots crunched on gravel as he made his way home, his mind churning, not with anger anymore, but with something sharper. A plan. By the time he stepped into his den and closed the door behind him, his pulse had steadied. The hurt was still there, of course, but it was buried now beneath a layer of cold resolve. He sank into his old leather chair, staring at the framed photos lining the bookshelf, their wedding day, their trips to the coast, the Christmas parties. All the smiles that now felt like lies. His gaze drifted to the desk, where a half-empty glass of bourbon sat untouched. He didn't reach for it. Instead, he reached for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Carl's number, the cafe owner who always seemed to know a little more than he let on. Grant hesitated only a second before pressing call. It rang twice. Carl's cafe, came the familiar voice. Grant leaned back, voice low and measured. Carl? I need a favor, and your discretion. As he ended the call, a small but unmistakable smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Small towns keep secrets, until they don't. The farmer's market on Main Street was in full swing, with stalls bursting with pumpkins, homemade jams, and hand-knit scarves. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of cinnamon and wood smoke, but Grant barely noticed. He moved slowly between stands, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his cap, ears tuned to the low hum of conversation that always seemed just out of reach. He'd lived in Somerville long enough to know, if you wanted to hear the truth, you didn't ask directly, you just had to listen. Margot was there too, lingering near the bakery stall, her eyes tracking him as he passed. She gave a small nod, her gaze understanding. Word had started to ripple, nothing direct, but little comments, sideways glances, the kind that felt like pebbles tossed into a still pond. Grant knew it wouldn't be long before those ripples turned to waves. Back at home, in the quiet of his garage, Grant unrolled an old blueprint over his workbench. It wasn't for a house or a project, just something to focus his restless hands on while his mind worked overtime. The garage was his sanctuary, its walls lined with tools and old photos from better times. He took a deep breath, the faint smell of motor oil grounding him, and sat down, staring at the space where a lawnmower once sat. Now, that spot was filled with evidence Carl had slipped him earlier that morning. Grant clicked on the flash drive and watched the grainy footage on his laptop. There was no mistaking the figures, Elena and Victor, together outside Hammond's Hardware on nights she'd sworn she was elsewhere. The images weren't scandalous, just close enough to tell the full story to anyone who'd been married as long as he had. A touch on the arm hair, a glance that lingered too long there. It wasn't just the affair that gnawed at him now, it was the betrayal of trust, the rewriting of their shared history. A knock sounded lightly at the garage door, pulling him from his thoughts. Margot stepped in, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Didn't figure you'd stop by the cafe today," she said quietly. Grant accepted the cup with a nod. "Didn't feel like company." They stood in silence for a moment, sipping. Finally, Margot said, "It's getting around, you know." Grant's eyes stayed on the laptop screen. "Yeah. I figured." She hesitated, then added, "Debbie mentioned something, said she thought she saw Elena with Victor again. This week. At the church lot." Grant's jaw tightened. "Church," he muttered. "Real nice." Margot put a gentle hand on his arm. "What are you going to do?" He didn't answer right away. His mind was churning, no longer in that raw, wounded way, but cold and sharp. Carl had given him the tools. The town was starting to piece it together. And now Debbie's words, well, that sealed it. He wasn't the only one who saw now. "I'll handle it," he said finally, his voice low, firm. Margot looked at him for a long beat. "Just, be careful. I've been there. Sometimes you think you've won, but all you've done is burn down what's left." Grant gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Not looking to win. Just ready to be done. That night, he sat alone in his den, flipping through old photos. Their wedding day, Elena radiant, him young and hopeful. Vacations, Christmas mornings, birthdays. The edges of the photos were worn, but the memories felt even more fragile now, like they might crumble at the slightest touch. He laid the photos down and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked around him, familiar and heavy. The phone vibrated on the table. A message from Carl, "Got what you asked for. Call when ready." Grant's fingers hovered over the keys, but he didn't respond yet. He looked out the window, across the darkened street. Debbie's porch light was still on, a soft glow in the quiet night. He thought about what she'd said earlier, that Elena had met Victor at the church parking lot. It was bold, almost brazen. And it was the final straw. He stood, pacing slowly to the window, watching the wind whip fallen leaves down the street. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, older, yes, but not broken. Not anymore. Then he muttered under his breath, words that felt like a quiet oath, "Then that's where it ends." "You deserve to know everything," Margot said, handing Grant a sealed envelope. He stared at it for a long second, the weight of it far heavier than the paper inside could possibly be. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering light across the living room walls. Outside, twilight pressed against the windows, and the old clock ticked loud in the hush between them. "Is this?" Grant asked, not finishing the sentence. Margot nodded. Carl pulled everything he could. "It's thorough." Grant set the envelope on the coffee table but didn't open it. His fingers tapped the armrest of his chair, restless, his jaw working as if chewing over words he couldn't quite say. Margot didn't push. She just sat quietly, eyes kind but watchful, understanding the moment's weight. "Debbie came by earlier," Grant said finally, his voice low. "She said she saw them. Again. At the church." Margot's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's bold." He gave a humorless laugh. "They don't even bother hiding it anymore." The fire popped, a log shifting as sparks danced up the flue. Grant leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames. "I don't even know what I'm doing anymore," he muttered. I thought getting the truth would help. But the more I know, the worse it feels." Margot reached out, placed her hand over his. "What do you really want out of this, Grant? Revenge? Closure? Or just, to feel something different than what you're feeling now?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the fire, but his thoughts were far away, drifting to the years before the cracks, before the cold dinners and stiff silences. He saw Elena laughing at a picnic, her head thrown back, sunshine in her hair. He saw their first Christmas in the Somerville house, the tree lopsided but perfect, their hands brushing as they hung ornaments. Where had that gone? And was it even worth chasing anymore? the envelope sat between them, silent and accusing. Grant sighed and stood. I need to see it for myself. Margot nodded, understanding. Be careful. He grabbed his coat and stepped out into the chilly dusk. The streets of Somerville were quiet, porch lights winking on one by one as neighbors settled in for the night. But Grant wasn't heading home, not yet. The church parking lot loomed ahead, its cracked asphalt shining under the glow of old street lamps. Grant pulled into a side street and killed the engine, sitting in the dark. He didn't have to wait long. A familiar sedan pulled up, and a moment later, Elena stepped out, bundled in her gray coat. Victor emerged from the driver's side, and even from a distance, Grant could see how easily they fell into step, close, too close for people who claimed it was nothing. His hands clenched on the steering wheel, knuckles white. Every instinct screamed to get out, to confront them, to shout the anger that had built like a storm in his chest for weeks. But he didn't move. Instead, he sat, watching them talk, heads bent close, her hand brushing his arm. They laughed softly, their voices carried on the cold wind like ghosts of something long dead between him and Elena. And then, Grant let out a breath. Slow. Deliberate. He unclenched his fists and leaned back in the seat, eyes closing for a moment. When he opened them again, they were still there, but something inside him had shifted. He started the engine quietly and turned away, leaving them behind in the glow of the church lights. For the first time, he realized that storm of anger, of hurt, betrayal, shame, it wasn't serving him. It had kept him tethered to a version of his life that no longer existed. And tonight, he cut the cord. Back home, Grant hung his coat, pausing by the mirror in the hallway. He looked at his reflection, tired eyes, lined face, but something steadier now. He walked back into the living room, the fire burned low but still alive. The sealed envelope still sat on the table, untouched. He stared at it for a long beat, then, almost without thinking, he picked it up and dropped it into the fire. The flames leaped, catching the paper instantly, curling the edges into black and lace. He watched until it was nothing but ash. It's not about them anymore, he whispered, almost like a prayer. It's about me. Victor's smirk faded fast when he saw Grant walk into the hardware store, with a lawyer. The bell over the door chimed its usual cheerful note, but the air inside Hammond's hardware turned brittle in an instant. Victor, stacking a shelf of paint cans, froze mid-motion. His usual polished demeanor faltered just enough to betray the flicker of surprise, and something close to worry. Grant stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. Beside him, Miss Turner, dressed in a sleek gray suit, held a manila folder with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what cards she was playing. Victor Hammond? Miss Turner's voice was crisp, professional. Victor set down the can a little too hard, straightening. That's me. And you are? Miss Turner. Legal counsel for Mr. Grant Caldwell. She handed over the envelope. Consider yourself served. This is a formal notice regarding harassment and an impending restraining order. Victor's smirk tried to make a comeback, but it was thinner now, brittle. Oh, come on, Grant. This is petty. You really want to drag this into court? Grant didn't flinch. His voice was calm, cold. You made your choices, Victor. Now I'm making mine. Victor opened the envelope, scanning quickly. His jaw tightened, eyes flashing with something dark. But Grant had already turned away, walking out with Miss Turner, leaving Victor standing there, papers trembling slightly in his hand. Outside, the autumn sun was bright but cold, the breeze sharp enough to sting. Grant breathed deep, the tension in his chest easing just a little. Nice move, Miss Turner said as they walked toward her car. But this is just the start. We should talk next steps. Divorce, Grant said, no hesitation. I'm ready. Miss Turner nodded, her tone shifting to business. We'll need to sit down and sort through assets, property, your house, any joint accounts. Do you have a prenup? Grant gave a wry smile. Didn't think I'd ever need one. She sighed, flipping open her planner. Okay. We'll do it the hard way then. But be prepared, it's rarely clean. They parted with a firm handshake, Ms. Turner promising to be in touch within the week. Grant climbed into his truck, staring at the steering wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. His chest felt lighter, but it was a strange lightness, a hollowing out, more than relief. That evening, back home, he sat on the porch with a blanket draped over his lap, coffee cooling in his hand. The yard was quiet except for the rustle of dry leaves skittering across the patio. The maple tree at the corner of the fence had shed most of its color now, bare branches reaching up to a gray sky. For a moment, he let himself feel it all, the sadness, the relief, the deep, tired ache of closing a chapter that had once meant everything. He thought of the wedding photo that used to sit proudly on the mantel, now tucked away in a drawer he hadn't dared open again. A low murmur of voices carried across the fence. Debbie and her husband, settling in for the evening, their laughter light and easy. Grant closed his eyes, listening, not out of jealousy, but something softer. A reminder that once, he too had known that kind of simplicity. His phone buzzed on the table beside him, jolting him back. Unknown number at first. Then it rang again, this time showing Elena's name. He stared at it, unmoving, as it buzzed insistently. Ms. Turner's words echoed in his mind, brace yourself. She might not let go easily. Grant's thumb hovered over the screen, his face unreadable in the dim light of dusk. Grant, please. Don't do this. We can fix it, Elena's voice trembled. She stood at the edge of the porch, her coat pulled tight around her shoulders as the sunset painted long, orange streaks across the quiet street. Grant sat in his usual chair, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, eyes trained on the horizon as if he could ignore her presence by sheer will. Elena, he said at last, voice low but steady, we're past that. She stepped closer, her boots crunching on the scattered leaves, eyes glossy with tears. You can't mean that. We've built too much to throw it all away. Grant's gaze didn't waver. You threw it away when you invited someone else into what we built. She flinched, a tear slipping down her cheek. I was lonely, Grant. For years, I felt invisible. You were always busy with your routines, your projects. She choked back a sob. I made a mistake. Grant let the words hang there, unmoving, his face unreadable in the fading light. More than once. And not a small mistake. Elena's breath came in shaky pulls. It wasn't just about Victor. It was about us, about feeling like I didn't matter anymore. He finally looked at her then, eyes tired, lined with pain but sharper now, resolute. You mattered. You always did. But you decided that wasn't enough. The wind rustled through the trees, scattering brittle leaves across the porch. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Elena knelt down beside his chair, clutching his hand with cold, trembling fingers. I'm begging you, she whispered. Don't let this be the end. I'll do anything to fix it. Grant pulled his hand away gently, setting his mug down on the railing. Some things can't be fixed, Elena. Not when trust is broken this deep. Her shoulders shook with silent tears, her breath visible in the cooling air. We promised forever, she said hoarsely. He stood slowly, pulling his jacket tight. Forever ended when honesty did. She stayed kneeling there as he stepped past her, the screen door creaking shut behind him, leaving her alone on the porch, bathed in the last golden rays of day. Later that evening, Grant found himself at the Pinecrest Diner, the familiar clink of plates and low murmur of conversations offering a strange comfort. He slid into his usual booth by the window, nodding at the waitress who automatically poured him a coffee refill. The jukebox in the corner played an old country song, its melody soft and familiar, wrapping around him like a threadbare blanket. Margot appeared a few minutes later, her eyes warm but watchful. She slid into the seat across from him without asking, her gaze searching his face. You okay? She asked gently. Grant exhaled, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. She came by. Begged me to reconsider. Margot's lips pressed into a thin line. And? He looked out the window for a moment, watching the headlights of a passing truck sweep across the parking lot. I told her it's done. Margot reached across the table, resting her hand lightly over his. That's not easy, even when it's the right thing. He nodded, eyes glassy but dry. It's strange. I thought I'd feel relief. But mostly, I just feel hollow. They sat in silence for a while, the waitress coming by to top off their coffees. Around them, the diner hummed with life, older couples sharing pie, a young family wrangling toddlers, a pair of teenage boys joking loudly in the corner. Life, messy and beautiful, kept moving forward. Margot finally broke the silence. Do you regret it? Grant looked down at his hands, turning the question over in his mind. Not yet, he said quietly. But maybe I will. She squeezed his hand, offering a small smile. One day at a time. The door jingled as someone entered, and Grant glanced up instinctively, half expecting to see Elena. But it was just Carl, waving briefly as he settled into a booth across the room. Grant's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, staring at the screen. A message from Elena: if you let this go, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. He sighed, placing the phone face down on the table. Margot raised an eyebrow. More drama? He shook his head. Just more of the same. She leaned back, studying him. What are you thinking? Grant met her gaze, his eyes clear now, the haze of pain slowly giving way to something firmer, quieter. I'm thinking she's wrong, he said, voice sure. I'll regret it if I don't. Margot smiled softly, nodding in approval. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the diner windows, but inside, the warmth of the booth and the low hum of conversation wrapped around them like armor. Grant sat back, hands wrapped around his coffee, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself breathe. A hush fell over the room as Grant walked into the town hall, divorce papers in hand. The building felt colder than usual, its high ceilings and pale walls suddenly oppressive rather than grand. Each footstep echoed, a hollow reminder that today was the day everything would be finalized. The day he'd officially let go of a life he thought was unshakable. He paused by the doorway, adjusting his tie, though he'd debated even wearing one. Habit won out. Elena sat at the long conference table near the window, her posture perfect as always, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a gray wool coat draped over her shoulders, her lips pressed into a thin line. For a brief second, their eyes met, and something unsaid, some deep, shared ache, passed between them. Then she looked away. Mr. and Mrs. Whitman? The clerk, a middle-aged woman with practical glasses and a tired smile, stood ready with a folder of documents. We're set to proceed. They both sat down across from each other. Grant placed the papers flat on the table, smoothing them out with deliberate care. His hand brushed lightly against the old gold band on his ring finger, a reflex now, though the meaning behind it had long eroded. He glanced at Elena, who hadn't removed hers yet either. Funny, he thought, how symbols linger even when love doesn't. The clerk began reading through the formalities. This document finalizes the dissolution of your marriage under South Carolina state law. As agreed, assets will be divided per the attached annex. Both parties are to review and sign each page. Grant barely listened. His gaze drifted toward the window, where the late autumn light slanted across Main Street. Outside, a few kids were tossing a football near the park. A man on a ladder was stringing up early Christmas lights around the lampposts. Life went on, indifferent to heartbreak. Elena cleared her throat lightly. Do we need to go through every line again? She asked the clerk, her voice flat but tinged with exhaustion. It's standard procedure, ma'am, the clerk replied gently. Grant nodded, silently urging it along. The minutes stretched painfully. Pen met paper, and with every scrawl of his name, a little more weight seemed to fall from his shoulders, and onto his chest all at once. Elena signed her pages quickly, her eyes never leaving the documents. No outbursts, no tears. Just two people, once deeply in love, now reduced to signatures and legalities. When it was done, the clerk gave a small, professional smile. That concludes everything. You're free to go. Grant rose first, folding his copy of the paperwork with careful precision. Elena gathered her things, standing a little too quickly, knocking her purse against the chair leg. Still, she didn't meet his gaze. She simply whispered, "Take care, Grant," and walked away, heels clicking down the long hallway until the sound disappeared completely. For a long moment, Grant just stood there, staring at the empty chair she'd left behind. It hit him then, this wasn't a fight, or a pause. It was the end. Outside, the crisp air bit at his face as he stepped onto the town hall steps. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and let his eyes drift over Somerville's familiar streets. It felt the same. It looked the same. But nothing was the same anymore. He didn't feel like going home right away. Instead, his feet led him down Main Street toward the cafe, Carl's Place, where comfort came in the form of black coffee and familiar chatter. As he pushed open the door, the warm smell of roasted beans and cinnamon hit him, easing something in his chest. Carl caught his eye from behind the counter and gave a nod of quiet respect, as if understanding without needing to ask. "Your usual, Grant?" "Yeah," Grant replied, his voice a bit hoarse. "And maybe a slice of that pecan pie, if you've got it." Coming right up. He spotted Margot and Debbie sitting by the window, waving him over with small, encouraging smiles. He slid into the booth beside them, the warmth of the coffee mug grounding him when Carl brought it over. "So," Debbie said gently, not prying but clearly aware. "It's done," Grant said simply, tracing the rim of his mug. "Signed, sealed, over." Margot reached across and gave his hand a brief squeeze. "Proud of you," she said. "Not because it ended, but because you saw it through." Grant nodded, staring into his coffee. "It's strange. I thought I'd feel relieved. But mostly, it just feels quiet." "That's normal," Margot assured him. "It's the quiet after a storm. You're still standing." They sat in comfortable silence for a bit, watching people come and go. Some neighbors glanced at Grant with curiosity, others with subtle sympathy. Small towns, after all, didn't keep secrets for long. But no one said anything. Life churned forward. Carl came by to top up their coffee and, without a word, placed a small plate of pie in front of Grant. A quiet gesture, but meaningful. Grant raised his mug slightly, offering a small toast. To new beginnings, and learning the hard way. Margot and Debbie clinked their mugs with his, smiling. As they chatted about other things, holiday plans, the town's upcoming Christmas fair, Grant's eyes wandered across the cafe. Near the back, he spotted someone he didn't recognize, a woman, alone, reading a book by the window. She glanced up briefly, their eyes meeting just for a moment before she returned to her pages. Grant looked down at his coffee again, a small, thoughtful smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. And for the first time in a long while, he felt open to whatever came next. The frost on the grass sparkled as the first sunbeam hit. Grant stepped outside, breathing deep. The crispness of the morning kissed his skin, the cold air clean and invigorating. He stood for a moment on the back porch, hands resting on the worn wooden railing, taking in the quiet miracle of a new day unfolding. A soft mist hovered over the lawn, and in the distance, birds chirped as if announcing some small but significant victory. It had been weeks since the final papers were signed, and life, in its own way, had settled. There were still moments, empty spots at the dinner table, echoes in the hallway, but more and more, Grant found solace in the stillness. Today felt different, though. As he exhaled into the morning chill, he could almost feel the weight lifting, layer by layer. He turned back inside, pulling a few worn boxes from the hallway closet. These had sat untouched for years, filled with keepsakes and remnants of a marriage that now belonged to memory. He set them down gently in the living room, one by one, opening the flaps with a kind of reverence. Inside were old photo albums, postcards from places he and Elena had once explored, and letters, some yellowed, others still crisp. Grant sifted through them slowly. A photo of their first home together. A card Elena had written on their 10th anniversary, full of words that seemed both distant and intimate now. He smiled faintly, allowing himself to feel it all, joy, grief, nostalgia. After a while, he began repacking the boxes, this time with a deliberate hand. Some things he kept. Others he gently placed in a discard pile, as if telling himself, it's okay to let this go. By late morning, he carried the boxes out to the garage, setting them in a corner to be dealt with another day. It wasn't about rushing. It was about moving forward at his own pace. His phone buzzed just as he was brushing off his hands. Margot's name lit up the screen. "Morning," he answered, leaning against the porch post. "Hey, just checking in," Margot said, her tone light. "I passed by the cafe and thought of you. You good?" Grant looked out over his yard, where the frost was already beginning to melt, tiny droplets catching the sunlight. "I'm okay," he said sincerely. "Actually, better than okay. Thank you for everything, Margot." "Really? You don't owe me thanks," she replied warmly. "Just keep doing what you're doing. One foot in front of the other." They chatted a few more minutes, about nothing in particular, really, and when he hung up, Grant felt a quiet kind of gratitude settle over him. For Margot, for the neighbors who'd stood by him, and for his own resilience, which had surprised even himself. Feeling a pull toward fresh air and open space, Grant laced up his boots and decided to head down to the lake. The trail was familiar but always comforting, winding through stands of bare trees and alongside the water, which shimmered faintly under the winter sun. His breath puffed out in small clouds, and with every step, his thoughts seemed to clear. He paused halfway, standing at a bend where the view opened wide. Ducks floated lazily near the far shore, and ice fringed the edges of the lake, delicate and fleeting. The world felt, for once, at peace. Grant found a spot on a bench and sat for a while, hands resting on his knees. He let himself think back, on the hurt, the betrayal, the long nights of doubt. But instead of tightening around him like before, those memories now felt softer, like a scar that had healed over. They were part of his story, but no longer defined him. The sun climbed a little higher, spilling gold across the frozen grass. Grant stood, stretching his arms wide, breathing it all in. He whispered to no one in particular, "I'm okay." And he meant it. On his way back home, he felt lighter, as if something had truly shifted. The house greeted him with its usual quiet, but it no longer felt hollow. Instead, it felt like truly his, filled with possibility. He was about to set his keys down when he noticed something sticking out of the mailbox by the front door. Curious, he walked over and pulled out a single, neatly sealed envelope. There was no return address, just his name written in a careful hand. Grant turned it over thoughtfully, a small smile playing at his lips. A new opportunity, waiting. Whatever it was, he knew now, he was ready. The quiet dawn that greeted Grant wasn't just another morning, it was a quiet testament to how far he had come. Through betrayal, heartbreak, and moments of deep doubt, he found his way back to himself, piece by piece. Life teaches us that pain doesn't have to define us, it can shape us into something stronger, clearer, and more whole. Like a winter sunrise casting gold over frosted fields, healing arrives quietly but transforms everything it touches. And if this story has stirred something in you, perhaps it's a reminder, no matter how fractured things feel, there's always a way forward, and sometimes, the most powerful step is simply choosing peace.